In this video, we're going to take a look at the developments that took place in Season 8, Episode 4 of The Curse of Oak Island. But first, I'd like to remind you that my book, The Oak Island Encyclopedia Volume 2, is still for sale on Amazon. This book is available in both full color and much less expensive black and white. If you'd like to get a copy for yourself or as a Christmas present for someone else, please check out the link in the description. Season 8, Episode 4 of The Curse of Oak Island begins at the stone structure on Lot 15, where the Lagina brothers and Doug Crowell have come to inspect the progress of archaeologists Laird Niven, David McInnes, Aaron Taylor, and Liz Meekles. McInnes informs the treasure hunters that the archaeological trench which he and his associates have been laboring on has reached glacial till, and that there is no more of the structure left to excavate. McInnes affirms his belief that the structure constitutes the remains of a pine tar kiln, and declares that he has sent a piece of charcoal he unearthed during the excavation for carbon dating. The narrator then informs us that the treasure hunters plan to conduct deep earth scans in the vicinity, and subject the area surrounding the structure to an extensive archaeological excavation, but that they will first need to acquire the requisite permits. Later that morning, Rick, Marty, and Alex Lagina meet in the war room to Skype with Craig Tester and David Irving of Irving Equipment Limited. Marty expresses his opinion that the crew has run out of time to sink any caissons in the Money Pit area that season, due to the delays resultant of the pandemic. Craig Tester then reveals that the team plans to hire Choice Drilling to conduct a drilling operation on the island that season, which he hopes will help the crew more accurately identify the areas at which they'd like to sink shafts in the future. The subject of the Big Dig, an enormous hypothetical excavation of the Money Pit area, is introduced during the conversation. Marty Lagina hints that this massive operation may commence next year. Meanwhile, Gary Drayton and Peter Fornetti do some metal detecting on Oak Island's Lot 32, near the southwestern corner of the swamp. Drayton quickly unearths the hand-forged head of an old single-bit axe, which he suggests is very similar to the rigging axe he and Jack Begley found on Lot 15 in the Season 8 premiere. Shortly thereafter, the treasure hunters find another axe head nearby, which is nearly identical to the first. In a later interview, Drayton states his belief that these Lot 32 axe heads are likely the same age as the artifacts recently discovered on Lot 15, the latter being the aforementioned axe head, the coin with the square hole, and the ox shoes found the previous episode. Drayton and Fornetti continue their metal detecting operation and find a third single-bit axe head. The British metal detection expert suggests that the profusion of axe heads in such a small area could indicate that the place was once the site of some sort of work camp. The treasure hunters call up Laird Niven and inform him of their recent finds, suspecting that they have stumbled upon another site of archaeological significance, similar to the ruins of the suspected tar kiln on Lot 15. The archaeologist meets up with Drayton and Fornetti and examines the axe heads. He states that the artifacts, quote, certainly aren't modern, unquote, and identifies them as forest axes, used for light work such as cutting limbs off trees. Later, the Oak Island team congregates in the war room to Skype with theorist Corjan Mol and Chris Morford, who presented their Oak Island theory back in Season 7, Episodes 8 and 9. After the narrator briefly summarizes the theory which Mol and Morford presented last year, which I will touch on later on in this video, the theorists show the treasure hunters a map of Oak Island, on which Nicolas Poussin's painting, The Shepherds of Arcadia, is superimposed, its top corners lying at the center and bottommost boulder of Nolan's Cross, respectively. In this diagram, which Mol and Morford presented during their previous Oak Island visit, the eye of the swamp lies at the forehead of the shepherdess in the painting. During their previous presentation, Mol and Morford explained their belief that the shepherdess's forehead holds special significance because it lies at the center of a pentagram around which the painting appears to be modeled, and because a similar-looking woman who sits in the background of Poussin's self-portrait has a third eye on her forehead, evocative of the Freemasonic all-seeing eye. In this episode, Mol and Morford demonstrate that a line drawn along the column of Nolan's Cross, when extended across the Atlantic Ocean, aligns perfectly with the royal way of the Palace of Versailles, the east-west axis of the palace gardens, and with the Avenue de Paris beyond. The narrator then informs us that Mol and Morford believe the fabled treasures of the Knights Templar were once stored in the Palace of Versailles, which was built at the behest of the great French King Louis XIV in the 1600s. Next, Mol and Morford make the case that the domain of Versailles was deliberately arranged in the shape of the menorah, the golden lampstand which illuminated the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Solomon. Finally, the theorists demonstrate that the line connecting Nolan's Cross with Versailles, when extended beyond the palace, intersects the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the site on which the Temple of Solomon once stood. Mol and Morford outline their belief that the Knights Templar recovered the lost treasure of King Solomon from the foundations of Solomon's Temple, over top which sat their first headquarters. Centuries later, some mysterious group or individual, whose identity is not revealed in this episode, ensured that the Palace of Versailles was built in such a way that its east-west axis, when extended southeast, intersected the Temple Mount. Presumably after the palace's construction, a related group buried Templar treasures, perhaps the two golden menorahs of the Kingdom of Israel, crafted before and after the destruction of the First Temple in 587 BC respectively, on Oak Island, and created Nolan's Cross along the line of the meridian established by Versailles' Royal Way. I'll return to this theory later on in this video. Finally, the theorists prescribe two possible locations at which they believe treasure will lie on Oak Island. They do this by first drawing a perpendicular line from the eye of the swamp to Nolan's Cross. They then draw a circle around the point at which the line intersects Nolan's Cross, its radius being the length of the line. That accomplished, they draw a second circle around the first circle, its radius being double that of the latter. The second circle touches the headstone at the center of Nolan's Cross. The theorists then draw a third circle concentric with the first two, its radius being 3 times the length of that of the first circle. The third circle touches both the uppermost and lowermost boulders of Nolan's Cross. Morford demonstrates that the southern half of his diagram forms the shape of a 7-armed menorah, when a line drawn from the northern vertex of the swamp to the center of the swamp's southern face is added to it. Finally, the theorists draw a pentagram, within and bounded by the middle circle, its upper vertex aligned with that of the larger pentagram which was formed when the Shepherds of Arcadia was superimposed over the swamp. The theorists suggest that Oak Island's treasure can be found at the 2 bottommost vertices of the smaller pentagram. Following Chris Morford and Corjan Mol's presentation, the Oak Island treasure hunters agreed to conduct excavations at the points of interest they prescribed. After the War Room meeting, Rick and Marty Lagina, Doug Crowell, Steve Guptill, and Billy Gerhardt head to the western edge of the swamp on Oak Island's Lot 11 to investigate the first of the 2 points of interest identified by Chris Morford and Corjan Mol. Guptill, who has determined the site's coordinates, leads the treasure hunters to the western point, which proves to be a shallow depression filled with swamp water. Both of the Lagina brothers observe that the spot, at first glance, appears to have been previously dug, and that the large mound sitting next to it speaks of old spoils. The narrator then suggests a possible connection between this feature and the axe heads discovered on Lot 32. The treasure hunters all agree that they ought to investigate this anomaly. Later in the episode, Doug Crowell, Steve Guptill, and Tom Nolan meet with Dr. Ian Spooner at the Lot 11 anomaly, which the treasure hunters have taken to calling West Hill. Equipped with a gravity corer, the geoscientist wades into the water-filled depression and takes a core sample of its bottom. Dr. Spooner observes that the sample contains a significant quantity, later revealed to be 30 centimeters, of sediment, which he suggests might be an indication that the feature is, quote, older than we think, unquote. Doug Crowell then suggests that, with the permission of Tom Nolan, on whose land the feature is located, they drain the anomaly and clear the brush which surrounds it. Nolan agrees to the proposal. At the end of the episode, Steve Guptill, Tom Nolan, and Dr. Ian Spooner meet in the Oak Island Research Center, where they Skype with Rick and Marty Lagina, Alex Lagina, Jack Begley, and Peter Fornetti. Begley, Fornetti, and the Laginas appear to be in quarantine, suggesting that this particular scene was filmed prior to the Laginas' return to Oak Island, and was crowbarred into this episode for the purpose of continuity. Guptill proceeds to inform the quarantined treasure hunters of the West Hill feature on Lot 11, and discloses that the pond measures 60 feet in length, 15 feet in width, and nearly 4 feet in depth. Dr. Spooner and Tom Nolan then voice their collective opinion that the feature constitutes the remains of some previous excavation. Spooner goes on to suggest that the pit is 300 years old, judging from the quantity of sediment in the core sample he took from it. Concurrent with their investigation of the West Hill feature, the treasure hunters examined the second point of interest identified by Mol and Morford, which lies on the border of lots 12 and 13. In a later interview, Marty Lagina states that the soil at this location, which the treasure hunters dubbed the East Hill, quote, obviously has been disturbed. It looks, from the evidence on the ground, that Fred Nolan bulldozed the area to build the peninsula which extends into the swamp. Now it's possible it could be deeper there, unquote. Near the end of the episode, various members of the Oak Island team use chainsaws to clear the area surrounding the East Hill point of trees and vegetation. That accomplished, Tom Nolan proceeds to excavate the point of interest with a backhoe, unearthing little more than dirt and a large boulder. While attempting to wrest a second boulder from the earth, one of the backhoe's hydraulic hoses bursts, forcing the treasure hunters to temporarily postpone the operation. In this episode, Chris Morford and Corjan Mol expanded upon the Oak Island theory they introduced in Season 7, Episodes 8 and 9. The theory which they laid out in those earlier episodes can be distilled into 6 main proposals. 1. The Latin phrase et in Arcadia ego, meaning even in Arcadia I, which appears in French classical Baroque artist Nicolas Poussin's 1627 and 1637-38 paintings entitled The Shepherds of Arcadia, is an anagram for Gite Neo Arcadia, an Italian phrase which translates to Excursion to New Arcadia. 2. Poussin's aforementioned paintings indicate that something of value is interred in Nova Scotia. 3. Poussin's 1627 painting Midas washing at the source of the Pactolus, which was intended to form a pendant painting with his first rendition of Et in Arcadia ego, symbolizes Nova Scotia's Gold River, which enters Mahone Bay just north of Oak Island. 4. Poussin's second, that is 1637-38, rendition of The Shepherds of Arcadia is modeled on a portion of a pentagram, the center of which aligns with the forehead of the shepherdess. 5. A painted lady wearing a hat who sits in the background of Poussin's 1650 self-portrait is the shepherdess from the artist's 1637-38 painting, The Shepherds of Arcadia. The third eye affixed to this lady's hat affirms the importance of the forehead of the shepherdess in Poussin's 1637-38 painting. 6. When Poussin's second rendition of The Shepherds of Arcadia is overlaid atop a map of Oak Island, with its uppermost corners aligning with 2 of the stones which comprise Nolan's cross, a treasure map is formed. This map indicates the presence of something significant at the forehead of the shepherdess, which happens to be the largest stone in the eye of the swamp, casually referred to by various treasure hunters in this episode as the Arcadia Stone. Mol and Morford are not the first to include Nicolas Poussin in their personal Oak Island theory, and Oak Island is not the only mystery to which theorists have attempted to connect Poussin. The aura of mystery and intrigue which surrounds the 17th century French painter today has its roots in 3 main sources. The mid-18th century Shepherd's Monument, which adorns the yard of Shugborough Hall in Staffordshire, England, on which a mirror image relief copy of Poussin's second rendition of The Shepherds of Arcadia and a cryptic unsolved inscription are carved. An elaborate 20th century hoax surrounding the Priory of Sion and the French village of Rennes-le-Chateau, which this author outlined in his analysis of Season 7, Episode 8, and a mysterious 17th century letter written to a French politician doomed to suffer a terrible fate, which I will touch on later in this episode. Mol and Morford's theory appears to be connected with a second source, and so a brief summary of the hoax may be required. A quick word of warning before I begin that summary. The story of the chronological unfolding of the mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau and the Priory of Sion is quite an enjoyable one, in this author's opinion at least, the telling of which I suspect would make for a particularly pleasant experience for those who enjoy stories in the Sherlock Holmes-style mystery genre. The following summary will spoil that story for those unacquainted with it, and so I invite those interested to pause this video, head on over to my video on Season 7, Episode 8 of The Curse of Oak Island, the link to which you can find in both the description and the top right-hand corner of this video, and skip ahead to 14 minutes and 35 seconds. The following is a brief summary of the hoax surrounding the mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau and the Priory of Sion. In the summer of 1956, a French draftsman named Pierre Plantard and his friend André Bonhomme legally registered an association called the Priory of Sion for the purpose of supporting the construction of low-cost housing in the community of Annemasse, located in eastern France near the Swiss border. The organization was named after Mont Sion, or Mount Sion, a nearby mountain on the slopes of which Plantard intended to establish a retreat center. The Priory of Sion dissolved 6 months after its founding, having accomplished little. Throughout the 1960s, Plantard worked to perpetrate what would become one of the most elaborate hoaxes of the 20th century. First, he conceived the story of a secret organization founded by the heirs of the Merovingian dynasty, a line of Dark Age Frankish kings who ruled France from the mid-5th to the mid-8th centuries AD. He decided to name this fictional society the Priory of Sion after his own defunct organization, Sion being synonymous with Zion, a name for the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, evoking ancient mystery and esoteric secrets. Plantard's fantastical organization was responsible for the formation of the Knights Templar, and its former Grand Masters included such august personages as Leonardo da Vinci, Sir Isaac Newton, and Victor Hugo, movers and shakers of European art and science. Its stated goal was to reinstall the heir to the Merovingian crown on the throne of France, the heir being Pierre Plantard, the Priory's current Grand Master. After stumbling upon a roadside sarcophagus near the village of Rennes-le-Chateau, bearing uncanny resemblance to the tomb depicted in Nicolas Poussin's second rendition of Et in Arcadia Ego, Plantard decided to include both the French painter and Rennes-le-Chateau in the Priory's fictional backstory. The Priory's motto became Et in Arcadia Ego, and Rennes-le-Chateau became the setting of a treasure story which would feature prominently in the Priory's mythos, in which a 19th century priest named Béranger Saunier discovered a secret treasure in his church after studying Poussin's 1637-38 painting. To fabricate evidence for his fictional organization, Plantard tasked his friend Philippe de Chérisy, a French surrealist, with fabricating a number of historical documents, some of which contained hidden codes hinting at the Priory's existence. In 1967, Plantard submitted these parchments to France's National Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale, under the title The Secret Files of Henri Le Bonneau. Finally, Plantard's friend, an author named Gérard de Sède, wrote a book entitled The Accursed Treasure of Rennes-le-Chateau, which outlined Béranger Saunier's treasure story and in which photocopies of some of de Chérisy's encoded parchments were included. De Sède's book was published the following year. Their work finished, the three co-conspirators waited for someone to read de Sède's book and take the bait they planted. In 1969, while vacationing in southern France, a British screenwriter named Henry Lincoln picked up a copy of de Sède's book. Lincoln quickly identified and decrypted one of the codes hidden therein. Fascinated, the screenwriter believed that de Sède's story would make for an excellent BBC documentary. He pitched his idea to a BBC producer, who approved the project and sent Lincoln to interview de Sède. Thus began Lincoln's multi-decade-long quest to unravel what would prove to be Plantard's extraordinarily complex hoax. Throughout the 1970s, Henry Lincoln produced 3 documentaries in which he showcased his discoveries, entitled The Lost Treasure of Jerusalem, The Priest, the Painter, and the Devil, and The Shadow of the Templars. In his second film, he consulted Professor Christopher Cornford of London's Royal College of Art. Cornford analyzed Poussin's second rendition of the Shepherds of Arcadia and determined that it seemed to be modeled around a portion of a pentagram. Corjan Mol and Chris Morford appear to have borrowed this part of Lincoln's work. Henry Lincoln would go on to outline his findings in a number of books. One of these was The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which he co-wrote with authors Michael Bagent and Richard Lee in 1982. Which would later serve as the inspiration for Dan Brown's mystery thriller novel, The Da Vinci Code. In their book, Lincoln, Bagent, and Lee proposed the notion that Et in Arcadia Ego might be an anagram for E, Tego Arcana Dei, a Latin phrase meaning, "Begone, I conceal the secrets of God." This idea appears to have inspired Corjan Mol and Chris Morford's interpretation of Et in Arcadia Ego as an anagram for GT Neo Arcadia, or Excursion to New Arcadia. Another book which Henry Lincoln wrote on Nicolas Poussin and the mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau is The Holy Place, first published in 1991. In The Holy Place, Lincoln, who refuses to concede that the discoveries he has made over the years are all based upon a groundless hoax, attempts to connect several locations important to the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery, including what he calls the Poussin tomb and Rennes-le-Chateau itself, with the Paris Meridian, a now obsolete Prime Meridian established by 17th century French scientists under the patronage of King Louis XIV. It is conceivable that Lincoln's work regarding the Paris Meridian, coupled with the fact that Louis XIV purchased Poussin's second rendition of the Shepherds of Arcadia in 1680 and brought it to his Palace of Versailles, from which it would later mysteriously but temporarily disappear, may have led Corjan Mol and Chris Morford to take a closer look at Louis XIV and his Palace of Versailles, leading to the latest iteration of their theory. In this episode of The Curse of Oak Island, Mol and Morford expand upon the theory they introduced back in Season 7 by demonstrating that an infinite line drawn through the column of Nolan's Cross forms an arc across the Atlantic which aligns almost perfectly with the Royal Way, the east-west axis which bisects the gardens of the Palace of Versailles. The implication of this demonstration appears to be that the creators of Nolan's Cross deliberately oriented their landmark so that it aligned with the layout of the Palace of Versailles. This implication begs the following question. At what point in history did surveyors possess the technology necessary to accomplish such a feat? I asked this question to Dag Pike, the author of a 2018 book entitled The History of Navigation. I'll tell you what Dag told me later in this video. In order to investigate a potential connection between Oak Island and the Palace of Versailles, we'll first have to take a look at the early life and reign of King Louis XIV of France, sometimes called Louis the Great, with whom the story of Versailles is inextricably intertwined. Louis was born on September 5, 1638, in the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a royal French palace situated on the outskirts of Paris. His mother, the Spanish Habsburg princess Anne of Austria, had failed to produce a non-stillborn heir throughout the course of her 23-year-long marriage to his father, King Louis XIII, and thus baby Louis was celebrated as a gift from God. Anne would give birth to her second and last miracle child, Philippe, Duke of Orleans, 2 years later, on the day preceding her 39th birthday. Louis's father, King Louis XIII, died when the young Dauphin, or heir apparent, was 4 years old. In defiance of her husband's dying wish that France be governed by a regency council until young Louis came of age, Queen Anne appointed herself Queen Regent. Following the example of her late husband, who had ruled France with the guidance of his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, Queen Anne nominated Italian Cardinal Jules Mazarin her first minister of state. Queen Anne possessed an unshakable belief in the divine right of kings, the notion that monarchs only come to power and rule through the will of God, and thus ought to be subjected to no authority aside from that of the divine. Accordingly, with the help of Mazarin, she worked to secure absolute power for her son Louis. Anne's subsequent encroachments on the rights of feudal courts called parliaments angered France's nobility, members of whom eventually rebelled against the crown in a grueling series of French civil wars known collectively as the Fronde. Young Louis grew up in the midst of this conflict, and learned from a young age to distrust the Parisian aristocracy, from whose agents he and his mother were often obliged to hide or flee. Louis legally came of age on his 12th birthday, thus ending his mother's regency. The Fronde lost momentum shortly thereafter and died in 1653, allowing Louis to rule France in relative peace through Cardinal Mazarin. Although Louis was officially crowned King Louis XIV of France in June 1654, he continued to entrust his chief minister with the governance of his kingdom. When Mazarin died in March 1661 at the age of 58, 22-year-old Louis announced that he would thenceforth rule France alone, without the aid of a chief minister. The king promptly set about reforming his government. One of his first acts as monarch was to accuse and convict Louis Fouquet, his superintendent of finances, of embezzlement, and have him imprisoned for life in the northern Italian fortress of Pignerol. He replaced Fouquet with his trusted servant Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who had convinced him of Fouquet's complicity in France's mounting debt crisis. Viewers may remember Louis Fouquet from my video on Season 7 Episode 8 of The Curse of Oak Island. A letter written to Fouquet by his brother, an abbé and future bishop from southern France, on April 17, 1656, seems to suggest that the painter Nicolas Poussin may have been privy to some sort of important secret. When translated from French to English, a portion of this letter reads, quote, "I have delivered to Monsieur Poussin the letter which you have done him the honor of writing to him. He has read it with all imaginable joy. You would not believe, monsieur, either the pains he takes for your service, the affection with which he takes them, or the merit and probity he brings in all things. He and I have planned certain things, of which I shall be able to talk to you in depth, which will give you, by Monsieur Poussin, advantages, if you do not wish to despise them, that kings will have great difficulty in drawing from him, and that after him perhaps no one in the world will ever recover in the centuries to come. And what is more, this could be done without much expense and could even turn to profit. And these are things so hard to discover that no one, no matter who, upon this earth today, could have better fortune or perhaps equal." Unquote. As mentioned in my earlier video, this cryptic letter is doubly intriguing in light of certain events which succeeded it. In the early autumn of 1661, about half a year after the death of Cardinal Mazarin, Nicolas Fouquet was arrested by the captain of the King's Musketeers and charged with embezzlement. After a 3-year-long trial, Fouquet was convicted and sent into exile. King Louis XIV, perhaps displeased with the lightness of Fouquet's punishment, commuted his former minister's sentence to imprisonment for life. The ex-finance minister spent the rest of his days locked away in the fortress of Pignerol, his only human contact for many years being his jailer, Benin Duvert de Saint-Mars, and his personal valet. Interestingly, whenever Fouquet's regular valet was indisposed, he was substituted by the so-called Man in the Iron Mask, a mysterious unidentified prisoner who was otherwise held in solitary confinement, and forced at all times to wear a mask of either iron or velvet. Following his dismissal of Louis Fouquet, the French king resumed his governmental policy reforms. In a radical move common to most rulers accorded the epithet the Great, Louis XIV resolved to relocate his royal residence and the seat of his government. Having grown resentful of Paris and its aristocracy, Louis determined to leave the historic French capital and establish a new home in Versailles, a country village located about 20 kilometers south of Paris, in which his father had owned a hunting lodge. In order to convert his father's property into a palace befitting the King of France, Louis XIV hired architect Louis Lavaux, landscape architect André Lenotre, and painter Charles Lebrun to expand the old chateau and its gardens. Interestingly, Lavaux, Lenotre, and Lebrun had just worked together to renovate the Vaux-le-Vicomte, the chateau of the freshly disgraced Louis Fouquet, at whose lavish housewarming party King Louis XIV allegedly became convinced that his superintendent of finances was indeed embezzling royal funds. From 1661 to 1668, the king's 3 chief architects carried out the first of 4 expansion projects, which would transform Louis XIII's old hunting lodge into the most magnificent palace in the history of the Western world. In time, Lavaux would add 2 new stone wings to the original chateau, and later 3 more which would envelop it. Lenotre would expand the lodge's original formal gardens into the spectacular Gardens of Versailles, complete with statues, fountains, flower beds, orchards, and the great cross-shaped Grand Canal. Lebrun, who incidentally had once served as the apprentice of Nicolas Poussin, would oversee the decoration of the palace's interior, including its iconic Hall of Mirrors. And French architect Jules Hardouin-Mansart, a later conscript in the growing army of professionals who labored to realize the king's dream, would design the grand stables and the king's apartment. Solar-inspired designs and images evocative of Apollo, the sun god of classical Greek mythology, were incorporated into the palace's interior and exterior design, Louis XIV having adopted the sun as his personal symbol and styled himself the Sun King. In 1682, in the midst of the palace's 3rd expansion project, the Sun King would officially move the French court to Versailles, stipulating that each of his nobles spend a certain amount of time there each year. Louis reasoned that, by keeping his enemies close, he could prevent them from conspiring against the absolute monarchy he and his mother had so painstakingly established. In a further effort to effect this end, the king would develop an elaborate series of daily rituals, which his courtiers would be obliged to perform during their stay, effectively keeping his guests occupied, and thus depriving them of the opportunity to engage in treasonous conversation with each other while at Versailles. In 1666, during the first flurry of construction at Versailles, Louis XIV's first Minister of State, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, founded what would become the French Academy of Sciences, a learned society dedicated to scientific research and discovery in service of the French crown. In addition to its first secretary, Abbé Jean-Baptiste Duhamel, the Academy's first members included French mathematician Pierre de Carcavie, Dutch inventor Christian Huygens, and Italian astronomer Giovanni Domenico Cassini. Hauchin's and Cassini's early involvement in the French Academy of Sciences is particularly interesting when considered in the context of Mol and Morford's implicit theory. Back in 1656, Christian Hauchens had invented the world's first pendulum clock. In 1673, under Colbert's sponsorship, he attempted, albeit without success, to create the very first marine chronometer, a clock able to function in the unsteady pilothouse of a sea-going ship, which would enable sailors to accurately determine their longitude on the ocean. Giovanni Cassini, on the other hand, is perhaps best known for his work on the Cassini map, the first truly accurate topographic map of France, which he, his son, and his grandson created throughout the 1600s through the use of a surveying technique called triangulation. In 1666, the year of the Academy's founding, the Society's founding members proposed the construction of the Paris Observatory, the oldest of its kind still in use today. King Louis XIV sanctioned the project, and the observatory was constructed in 1667. That year, on Midsummer's Day, before construction of the observatory commenced, members of the French Academy of Sciences personally outlined the building's foundation in a vacant Parisian plot. This plot was carefully chosen, as it was bisected by the Paris Meridian, a line of longitude which French cartographers, for the next 2 centuries, would use as their prime meridian, the imaginary line separating the eastern half of the world from its western counterpart, from which all points of latitude were reckoned. When construction of the Paris Observatory was finally completed in 1672, the Paris Meridian was inlaid in brass across its stone floor. The question regarding the period in history at which surveyors possessed the technology necessary to accomplish the feat suggested by Mol and Morford hinges upon historical advancements in longitudinal calculations. Although sailors have been able to accurately calculate longitude for centuries through the use of solar charts, longitude was traditionally calculated through the often inaccurate process of dead reckoning. Difficulties in measuring latitude posed such a problem that several European kingdoms throughout the Age of Discovery offered substantial rewards to any scientists who could invent an accurate method of determining longitude, especially while at sea. Habsburg Spain was the first kingdom to offer such a reward in 1567. The Dutch Republic followed suit in the early 1600s. In 1675, 3 years after the construction of the Paris Observatory, King Charles II of Great Britain sanctioned the construction of the Greenwich Observatory in England for the express purpose of finding out, quote, the so much desired longitude of places for the perfecting of the art of navigation, unquote. With its role in the construction of the Paris Observatory, the first of its kind in modern European history, and with both Christian Hauchens, the inventor of the first marine chronometer, and Giovanni Cassini, the creator of the first accurate map of France, being among its founding members, the French Academy of Sciences was clearly at the forefront of the quest to resolve this most important issue of 17th century European science. Although 17th century French navigational scientists under the patronage of Louis XIV were certainly preeminent among their European counterparts, the question of whether they or any of their successors had the capacity of building Nolan's Cross so that it aligned perfectly with the Royal Way of Versailles is a matter of debate. Dag Pike, for one, doesn't think they did. In private correspondence with this author, Mr. Pike wrote, quote, as for the time when techniques might have been capable of such a measuring, I would suggest perhaps within the last 50 years, when position-fixing accuracy was improving, unquote. Whatever the case, the alignment of Nolan's Cross with the Royal Way of Versailles is truly uncanny, adding yet another facet to the ever-evolving mystery that is Oak Island. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to help support this channel, please check out my book, The Oak Island Encyclopedia Volume 2, which you can find by clicking the link in the description.